This is a bit out of my usual wheelhouse, but I really want to try stabilizing wood with resin. I'm not looking to do any crazy colors, and I'm not even gonna do anything with like punky, soft, mushy, what's it called, spalted wood. What I have here is some perfectly solid, more or less quarter-sawn birch. It really doesn't need stabilizing, but there are some other benefits that I'm looking for. I want to make it a little bit harder, heavier, and more stable when it comes to moisture changes, so that it doesn't distort and warp so much. All of which I think could be very useful for tool handles. So this is going to be an experiment in a couple of ways. Firstly, is it worth doing? Will I get a substantially better tool handle? And that is not really something I'm gonna find out in this video. That's gonna come in the next one. This video is about finding out, is it even possible? Because I'm gonna try to do this without a vacuum pump, without a vacuum chamber, and without a toaster oven. All of that is pretty expensive equipment, and it takes a lot of space, and I don't really want to invest in that before I know if it's even something that I want to do. If I dry this out to really close to 0% moisture and then let it sit in the resin for, I'm thinking, at least a week, maybe 2 weeks. My hypothesis is that it will get quite a lot of resin in it if it's properly dry and left to sit and soak for many days. So I have this piece, which is what I will hopefully use for my handle, and I have this, which is a sacrificial test piece that I'm later in this video going to cut open and see exactly how deep the epoxy did penetrate. But the first step will be to dry this out. I'm just going to use my normal oven for that. That's why we are in my kitchen. If you want to dry wood in your own oven, all I can say is do your own research. There's a big difference between the temperature at which water evaporates and the ignition point for wood. So in theory it shouldn't be a fire hazard, but don't take my word for that. Do your own research and make your own decision based on that. That's what I'm going to do, because that's the only option I have. So yeah, let's throw these in the oven and take it from there. So, with my oven set to just above the boiling point, I allowed the two pieces to cook for several hours. Before that, I had taken their weight, and every hour or so I took them out for weighing again. When the number seemed to stabilize, I noted it down and put the piece back in the oven. And you keep doing this until you can no longer detect any drop in weight. The scale reads the same as the last time. That should mean the wood has lost all moisture it can and is at more or less 0%. At this point, the wood has to be sealed airtight, so it can cool down without absorbing new moisture from the air. I used Ziploc bags for this. Once they were down to room temperature, I took them out of the bags and placed them in the container that I was planning to use for the resin soak. They will need to be weighed down, otherwise they will float in the resin, so a plant pot goes on top. And then comes the resin. This is basically the same stuff as cactus juice, I believe. A 1-part resin that cures by heat rather than by adding a hardener. That's why the wood has to cool down before soaking, and that is also why soaking is even an option, because it will never harden as long as you don't cook it. And then I waited. It had a bit of a smell, so I put the container in a plastic bag, and 2 weeks later it came back out. My first feeling, lifting the pot, was disappointment that the pieces still wanted to float. Had they not even absorbed enough resin to lose their buoyancy? But the stream of air bubbles seemed to have ceased, or at least slowed a lot, so that was something. With gloves on, I took the pieces out of the bath, and in an attempt to keep the mess contained, I wrapped them in aluminium foil. The unused resin was then poured back into the bottle, and here I got a bit more hopeful, as the bottle didn't fill all the way back up. It seemed like probably a couple 100 milliliters had been taken up by the wood. Here then comes my solution for cooking the resin without a dedicated oven, because that is not something you'd want to do in an oven where food will be prepared. Instead, I bought a wide saucepan from a charity shop and brought up some water to a boil. This pan won't be usable for food either, but it was a lot cheaper and smaller than a whole oven. I left them in the simmering water for the duration of time specified in the instructions for the resin. They refer to using an oven, but the temperature was pretty much the same, and I figured that should be what matters. When they were ready, I let them cool down again and unwrapped the packages. The foil was basically glued to the wood, and I'm not sure it really helped to contain anything. The resin isn't water soluble anyway, so maybe it would have worked just as well without the foil entirely. But with the foil removed, I weighed the pieces one last time and then calculated how much they had gained compared to the original measurement before the drying process. At around 100 grams heavier each, they both had increased about 30%. So with that, the stabilizing is done, so let's head to the workshop for some destructive testing. The piece I want to use gets set aside, and then I set to work sawing the other piece in half along the grain. It cut quite easily, but the dust was much smaller than usual. I planed it flattish with a power planer, then took a few swipes with the number 5 set to a shallow cut. It felt not too different from how birch normally feels, quite pleasant to plane. The shavings came out looking usual, and the planed surface felt smooth and wood-like, not noticeably more plastic. Comparing it visually to an untreated piece of the same board of birch, the stabilized piece appears ever so slightly darker, and interestingly, it looks perfectly even. I was expecting a patch of bare wood in the middle, but no such thing is visible. Next I wanted to do a test of how tough the stabilized piece is against denting. I put it in the vise alongside the untreated chunk from the same board, and gave them a bunch of hits, trying to keep my force the same each time. Not perfectly scientific, obviously, but taking the average of all these strikes should even out the discrepancies. I then measured the depth of the divots as accurately as I could. The average depth of the control piece was 0.19 millimeters, and the average of the stabilized piece 0.05 millimeters. I wrote down that this means the stabilized piece is 3.8 times harder by dividing 0.19 by 0.05. I don't know if that really is how it works, but I do think this is a significant result. Alright, so there we have it. I am very surprised by these results. I was expecting to see a very noticeable dry spot in the middle, like the resin has entered a certain way but then been stopped by the air that couldn't get out. And that is not at all what has happened. The resin is perfectly evenly distributed in this piece as far as I can tell. I know that there is resin throughout because of the hardness test. There was a clear difference there. And I also know that there is some air still in it because the pieces did float in the resin. It's definitely not 100% saturation, but there's also no dry spots in it. So if I were to start carving this and make it into some sort of handle shape, for example, then there's not going to be any unstabilized patch inside of it to worry about. So in terms of hardness, this was definitely successful. In terms of weight, which is also something I'm looking for, a 34 to 38% increase is not too bad. And as for stability, I don't really have a way to measure that, but I definitely expect this piece to move a lot less than this, given how much resin there is in this. It should make it absorb and lose a lot less moisture, which means less movement. The color is not something I really care about. I like the look of wood. That's why I work with wood. I don't want it to look like plastic. So the fact that it doesn't look like this on the outside, this very thick layer of resin has a much more plasticky look, but here it looks much more natural. I think that's a good thing. If you want to put dyes in it and play around with crazy colors, I don't know how that would work with this method, but given that there is no dry spot in here, I would assume that pigments would also be quite equally distributed throughout the piece, but that is just a guess. And then there is the time, of course. It did take 2 weeks, but that is not 2 weeks of actual work. It's just putting it in a bath and letting it sit there while you're doing other stuff. So if you want to stabilize wood like this, you definitely have to plan ahead a little bit in order to have your piece ready when you need it. But for me, that's worth it compared to buying a vacuum chamber and a pump and letting that run for hours using electricity, and there's a lot of saving to be had there. So is it worth waiting 2 weeks to have something that's 30-ish% heavier, maybe 3 to 4 times harder? Yeah, I think so for me, but what do you think? Would you use this method, or is it better to just get a vacuum chamber and do it properly? Let's talk about it in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.